preaching to the choir. Just on the economy, the national debt has topped $22 trillion. I'm getting this from the Morning News. This is not some obscure publication. I'm getting it from, have you read the paper?
It's getting more obscure every day.
It's getting more obscure. But the national debt tops $22 trillion. The budget deficit for this year is expected to approach $1 trillion. And the budget deficit for next year will go over $1 trillion. That's the seriousness of the economic situation that we're in. Furthermore, in the last big crisis, when Obama first got elected and they were in a terrible crisis, the first thing he did was try to round up some support around the world. You know, it was dealt with as a world problem, and he tried to get, you know, participation from the rest of the world. That is not happening now. That is not very likely. The G7 is going on right now, and I think the word that the Dallas Morning News used to describe the prospects, the word was bleak. The prospect of cooperation just in the G7, and that doesn't include China. It's just the former world's greatest imperialist nations. Japan, Canada, United States, and European nations. And they are not expected to agree on much. And they didn't get off on a very good start with the trade war going on. So not only is the economy in terrible trouble, but the means of solving a problem are much less accessible than they were before. For example, usually when we see a recession coming, the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates. But they have been cutting interest rates most of the time since 2008, so they don't really have a lot of room to mess around with the rates. So there's not a lot of tools to deal with the economy. The world's growth rates are falling. And I read one thing that said Germany was already in recession, and then another one thing that said it was almost in recession. But anyway, the international situation, the economies of our friends looks worse than ours. And I think that's the reason why we're seeing the stock market jump up and down like it has been recently. It lost yesterday, I think, 2.4%. And we were trying to figure out how much dollars that was a while ago. We think it's around $600 billion disappeared yesterday. So the stock market, of course, is not the same thing as the economy, but it is a leading indicator. Another leading indicator is the yields on bonds. In other words, what the cost of borrowing. And last week, they had the phenomenon came about that you couldn't get a better deal on bonds by buying long-term bonds as short-term bonds. And you can think of this, it's easier for me to understand as CDs. If you were trying to get a CD for 1 year, you might get a certain percent on your CD. But if you were trying to get one for 10 years or 5 years, you could get a much bigger interest rate, right? Well, the strange thing, and the same thing is true of bonds. If you get the 10-year bond, you're supposed to get a much nicer interest rate on it, but it's not true. They actually, it's the same for a 1-year bond as it is for a 10-year bond, and they're calling that the inverted something.
Bond inversion.
Okay, and so this precedes recessions, and they say it has preceded every recession since such and such. So it's a bad sign. So the economy is certainly in crisis in global terms. I talk about inequality everywhere I go because it's unsustainable. I know you hear these numbers all the time. I mean, Bernie Sanders brings it up every time he talks. I think he says 3 billionaires now have as much as 40% of the poorest people, something like that. And I have a number of those statistics like that The Federal Reserve reported that the top 1% owned 40% of the country's wealth. The top 10% of the world has more than 70% of the combined total wealth of China, Europe, and the United States. The bottom 50% owns 2% of the wealth, and the middle 40% owns less than 30% of the wealth. So inequality is bad, very, very, very bad, and getting much worse. And it's unsustainable. You can't just push people off the edge of the economy, not if you expect them to come to work the next morning. Alice Walton has $46 billion. She lives here. Alice Walton has $46 billion. You don't. And yesterday, David Koch died. Koch died, and his estate was worth 50 point something billion. He and his brother were tied for 11th place as among the richest Americans. We had this protest, and the reason I put this sign here is because this is a very good coalition that's been built around these guys that do the catering for American Airlines. A number of us that are in this room were at a big demonstration Tuesday a week ago, and they have put together a really good coalition, but they're trying to get $15 an hour. And the CEO of American Airlines, it was announced from the podium, makes $6,000 an hour.